The Illuminate Arts and Faith Conference in Chattanooga, Tennessee wants to help you find your tribe. Do you get way too excited about quoting Wendell Berry or C.S. Lewis in conversations with coworkers? Does your Spotify playlist include hymns, a little jazz, and a whole lot of Andrew Peterson? Join your tribe at Illuminate March 31 and April 1 for education and inspiration from speakers Russ Ramsey, Douglas McKelvey, John Hendricks, and others. Find a complete list of session topics and ticket information at southern.edu/illuminate.
In 2024, I set out to meet as many poets as I could and spend an hour with each one. I got more than I bargained for, more insight, more clarity, more hope. It's proved to be one of the richest highlights of my life. 17 writers, 17 deeply human conversations that made me sit up and pay attention. Franz Kafka once said, if the book we're reading doesn't wake us up with a blow to the head, what are we reading for? A book must be the axe for the frozen sea within us. And that's what I hope this new book will do. I hope it wakes us up, my friends. I hope these conversations will be the catalyst for something to be reawakened, re-enchanted, and reinvigorated. It's called An Axe for the Frozen Sea, Conversations with Poets About What Matters Most. I'm Ben Palpin, and I hope you'll come and listen in as I spend a little time with poets like Lucy Shaw, Malcolm Guite, Dana Gioia, and Lee Young Lee. Pull up a chair at the table as we dig into what it means to write well and to live well. An Axe for the Frozen Sea is now available from Rabbit Room Press. Visit the store at rabbitroom.com, or better yet, ask about it at your favorite bookseller.
The tragic and comic masks, the sad mask or the laughing mask. You really still have two choices in life: to be bitter or sort of to laugh at acknowledgement of your own frailty and weakness, and stop fighting the pain, that the pain's going to come. I mean, I just see it in people who are religious and not religious. I can see one of these two paths.
Welcome to the Habit Podcast, conversations with writers about writing. I'm Jonathan Rogers, your host. It's always a pleasure to have Harrison Scott Key on the Habit Podcast because he's one of the funniest people I've ever run across. So I was a little apprehensive to read his new memoir, How to Stay Married, the most insane love story ever told. It's the story of how infidelity tore his marriage apart and how he and his wife Lauren patched it back together. I didn't see how that could be funny. More to the point, I wasn't sure I wanted such a story to be funny. But it is. It's hilarious, and it's wise, and it's exceedingly hopeful. To quote the jacket copy, How to Stay Married is a comic romp unlike any in contemporary literature, a wild pilgrim's progress through the hellscape of marriage and the mysteries of mercy. Harrison Scott Key, I'm so happy to have you on the Habit Podcast today.
I'm happy to be back, man. Thanks for the invite.
Yeah, I love your new book, How to Stay Married, the most insane love story ever told. Tell us what this book. Could you summarize what this book is about? I know you've been doing a lot of podcasts. I hope you got some good practice.
That is tough. How to summarize this book? It's like, how do I? I mean, this book has become a lot of different things to a lot of different people. Some people look at it as like a therapy book. Some people look at it as a book on Christian marriage or theology. Tons of people who are not religious are reading the book, and they're either really turned off by the religious aspect, or they appreciate it or don't even really notice it. People really notice in this book. I think they bring a lot of themselves to a book like this. So it was much easier to describe this book, 6 weeks ago when it came out, because it was just my book. But now it seems to belong to everybody else. This, in the short answer to your question, is ostensibly this is a book about what it was like to learn that my wife was having a long-term affair with my neighbor and sort of what happened in the aftermath of that. Yeah. but in a more sort of abstract conceptual sense. The book is really a mystery. It's a mystery novel, and like a good mystery, there's a murder in the beginning, and the thing that is murdered is my marriage, and or at least I discovered that it had been murdered a long time before. Yeah. And so the investigation is who killed this thing? Is it really dead? And who's to blame? And what do we do now? And so there's a lot of urgency in the book. It reads like a novel. I mean, it reads fast.
Yeah, it does.
That was in some sense, that was the fun part of writing it, was trying to figure out how to keep people turning the page for this story that could very easily just be, it could just be awful or so brutal that you didn't want to keep reading. So that was the real challenge, is how do you make people keep reading and not look away from the train wreck?
Yeah. Yeah. When I heard that this book was coming and I heard what it was, I was pretty worried. I mean, knowing how funny you write and knowing that that this was going to be a funny book, and yet it was about, adultery and a marriage breaking up. And I was worried about how you were going to do that. And if anybody could do this in a way that was respectful to the people involved.
Yeah.
And I read it in about a day. I mean, I devoted much of Father's Day to reading this book. And it was just so incredibly compelling. It's not that I didn't expect it to have a lot of depth, but it was just even more depth than I was expecting. So, man, thank you for what you've done here.
Well, I appreciate it. That means a lot. Thanks.
Well, as I said, it is a funny book. I've heard you say somewhere, talking about humor and comedy as a path to truth telling. I'd love to get you headed down that track.
Well,
because it can be a way of deflecting truth. Humor.
Sure. Yeah. 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 I think just humor is sort of my MO. That's my base level. That's my factory setting, no matter what it is. I am always going to be that is my, that's my neutral, is funny. That's just how I look at the world, how I process the world, how I understand the world. Usually when I'm making jokes, that's usually an unconscious way to understand what in the heck is going on in any particular situation. And I've always been fascinated by the comedy of manners that is modern life, the things we say and don't say. And, obviously there's a lot of church in this book, and church is one of those places where we think one thing and experience another thing. We do one thing and, everybody loves the pastor, but the sermons are just deathly boring. But nobody will say a word about it because he's such a nice guy. That's comedy's bread and butter is when everybody's saying one thing but doing another. And that's sort of where I live. I'm not going to say that I'm autistic, but I definitely have a strange kind of meta relationship with reality where I'm not always sure of how to be in any situation. I mean, I think most people on the spectrum are not have that experience. Am I saying, doing, wearing the right thing? What am I supposed to do in this situation? And so comedy is always like, if I can make a joke and people laugh, then I know that I've sort of found my place in that situation. Maybe I wore the wrong thing to the party, but if I can make a joke about it, it makes it okay. So I kind of know where I stand. So that's just how I move through the world. And so, so it's less, I'm going to use humor as a tool to do a thing. And it's more of, how can I tell people this story, with with the gravity it demands, but still sound like myself, still do it like, I mean, when this was happening, when I found out, so there were several revelations in the book, moments where I discovered something that I had not previously known. And in most of those occasions, obviously, as soon as I learned the startling truth about the thing, it was not funny at all. It was very, very far from it. But by the time I was ready to tell people, whether it was, to call my best friends or to talk about what happened, maybe a few days, maybe a few weeks, in some cases, a few months had passed. And so by the time I got ready to tell them, I had already sort of come to grips with the strange incongruities of the story. And that's where comedy lives, is incongruity.
Yeah. So
when I would, there are many scenes in this book where I'm relating to my friends what happened, and I couldn't help but be funny about it. I mean, it was funny. Like, I don't want to be crass or flippant, but like when I really sat down and started talking, like, when my buddies asked me, they're like, well, who is this guy that your wife is in love with? I couldn't help but be funny when describing the guy. I mean, he was an absolute like dingbat. I mean, obviously he had a lot going for him, for a married woman to fall in love with him. He had something going for him. And I talk about that in the book, what she did love about this guy. But in a very different sense, it was, like, obviously I could have been really, really mean to the guy in the book. And I think I'm pretty fair with him. I have I take a few digs, but when I'm trying to describe to my, best friends, who my wife has fallen in love with, like, you have a choice, man. You can laugh or cry. You can get bitter, or you can lighten up a little bit. Yeah. And so those moments of, when terrible things happen to you, and if you're alive long enough, they will. People die, people get cancer, people lie, cheat, and steal. You get broken into, your house gets destroyed by a tornado. Really bad things happen to every human on the planet. And it's very easy to let those things turn you bitter. But if you can laugh, if you can see the joke, then that at least makes it bearable. And so, I remember sitting with my buddies on the church steps. I'm in a couple of bands, but I go to church with all the guys I'm in bands with, and we rehearse at the church because that's where all the instruments are set up. And so after rehearsal one night, we were sitting out there drinking a beer on the church steps, and and I said, it would have been, and I had so many therapeutic moments on these church steps with my band members, and I was like, just think of how much worse it would be if the man my wife had fallen in love with was like really, really handsome and had tons of money. Now that's funny too. That's funny a whole other way. Yeah. But just recognizing those strange incongruities made it bearable and funny. When I found out, at one point when I found out my wife wanted to leave, she couldn't move out because she was about to have a hysterectomy. And I talk about this in the book. Is that sad? Yeah, that's a little sad. Is it weird? Yeah, it's weird. But it's also funny that I have to now take care of this woman who has prayed for my death on many occasions. And
is that literally true?
Oh yeah, she said she had often wished that I would, die in a plane crash or get hit on my bike, and that was funny. She's telling me this while she's in the bed after surgery, and I mean, you can laugh or you can cry. I kind of like to do both, and so I'm laughing. And part of the reason I'm laughing is that I'm not dead. I'm there taking care of her. And I'm laughing that somehow, like, in this wild story, I mean, I have always been the bad cop, the bad guy in my marriage. I'm the loud one. I'm the mean one. I'm the funny one. I'm the one who talks too much and gets weird at parties. And I'm the one who yells at the children and raises my voice and, drags the dog across the floor to put him in his crate. Like, I'm the dad. I'm a big bear. And so I laughed when I was taking care of my wife that somehow I'm the good guy in this situation. Like, that was funny to me.
Yeah.
So there's comedy running through this whole thing.
Well, I mean, you say that comedy lives in incongruity. You also say that comedy is a path to truth. I think that's because the nature of reality is incongruity, right? We have all these ways of avoiding reality, and then when we're faced with the reality, it feels incongruous, right? It feels when we're upside down and we face the right side up, that feels upside down or incongruous.
Yes. Well, to that point of comedy as a truth detector, comedy is one of those weird things that works. I mean, all art works on an unconscious level, but when you read a sad story out loud in front of people, or just a story, a literary story, they might applaud. They might, do one of those thoughtful, they might do that. But if it's a funny story and people laugh, that's how you know something true has been said. And so laughter in some sense is this Geiger counter that tells you when truth is near. And obviously there is a kind of laughter that's mean and cruel, but even laughter that's defensive or deflective, that's a truth detector, because when I tell you, okay, if my wife and I are in a discussion and she's mad, and it's so obvious that she's mad, and I go, "Why are you mad?" And she goes, "I'm not mad. I am so not mad." It's so obvious that she is. Like, that's funny. She's deflecting. But even the deflection is a sort of pointer to truth. Like, that's why we laugh at irony, because clearly what the situation is not what the person is saying. Yeah. When you're up to your neck in quicksand, and you tell your friends, "I'm fine," they say, "We're going to the bar. Do you need anything?" And you're like, No, I'm fine. Like, that's irony, because it's funny, because obviously you do need help. Yeah. So that's why I think, for me, who is often so lost in modern life, in my role as an employee, a teacher, a parent, a husband, a friend, I often don't know where I stand. But when I start to hear people laugh, I get a better idea of where things stand in that situation. And so for me, it's always been like it's been my emotional support animal, comedy.
Yeah, one way or another, whether it's backwards or forwards, it's a sign pointing toward what's true.
Yes. So, like, something's going on. If people are laughing, something's going on there that it bears investigation.
Yeah. Do you know Buechner's book, Telling the Truth, The Gospel is Tragedy, Comedy and Fairy Tale?
Yeah, I wrote about that in my dissertation.
Okay. I'm not surprised to hear that. I thought about that section on comedy pretty often as I was reading your book. Yeah. And I went back to look at that chapter and was really surprised at how relevant it is. I'd love to hear you react to some of these things that Buechner has to say. He says, the comedy of grace as what needn't happen and can't possibly happen because it can only impossibly happen. Like, grace like a joke is that which can't possibly happen because it can only impossibly happen. And it happens in the dark that only just barely fails to swallow it up. And when I think about the comic, I mean, I'm giving away the ending of your book, but so does the cover of your book, that you stay married. In this seemingly impossible happy ending.
Yeah.
That I really thought of, and this dark that very nearly swallowed it up, but failed to. That couldn't. This thing that seemed inevitable turned out not to be inevitable after all.
Yeah, that's grace. I mean, that's whether you're a believer or it's just an interesting idea. It shows you how stories work. I'm always been fascinated by tragedy and comedy, and then all the sort of story forms that live in the middle of that space. But I'm most fascinated in kind of what I wrote about in my dissertation, which I published 20 years ago, and I would really squirm to read it now, even though my computer on my standing desk, I use my thesis and my dissertation as a platform for my laptop. So
I'm glad you get some use out of it.
I know exactly. But I wrote about this idea that and this just seemed so perfectly tied into to Christian theology, this idea of stories. I was always fascinated by how stories worked, mostly because I couldn't put one together. When I was in grad school, when I was in my 20s, I loved great stories. I loved reading plays and novels and books, but I just couldn't write one. And so I was fascinated by how they were put together, and I tried to make sense of it, and especially comedy. And but this idea that, so in tragedy, which we're talking about, like classic tragedy, Oedipus Rex, Hamlet, Death of a Salesman, the tragic hero typically, not always, but typically is a good, noble person. I mean, you learn that in high school English. The tragic hero is noble, but they have some fault. But they live in a noble world, and they're trying to do the noble thing. And yet they die anyway. They're punished, exiled, or they die like Hamlet, or exiled like Oedipus Rex. Even though they're what you would call good people. These are good people trying to do a good thing. Hamlet's trying to figure out, like, did his uncle really kill his mom, and how does he avenge that and right this wrong? Oedipus Rex is trying to figure out, like, why is there a plague in this city? Like, who's to blame for this? Whereas in a comedy, the comic hero starts where the tragic hero ends. The comic hero starts with, like, nothing's going to work out. I'm a liar. I'm not a good person. I mean, every comic hero that has stayed with us as a culture is a liar. They're a fake. They're a phony. And yet somehow in their weakness, when the mask is ripped off at the climax of the Seinfeld episode, or the Office episode, or the climax of the Shakespearean comedy, when the mask is ripped off and they are going to receive judgment, they are going to be punished and exiled or fired or whatever, they're saved by an acknowledgement of their foolishness and their weakness. That's what saves them. The weakness is what saves them. The sort of vulnerability is what saves them. And I was fascinated by that, and I still am. And this idea of, like, weakness is what triumphs, or meekness is what triumphs in comedy. And that's where the happy ending is so shocking, and yet there it is.
Yeah. I've always said if I was a preacher, I would have an altar call that all you would do is come down and say, "What a fool I've been," you know?
Yeah, that's good. Yeah. I am an idiot.
Yeah. Well, I mean, since you mention it, I'm back on Buechner. He says the good news breaks into a world where the news has been so bad for so long that when it is good, nobody hears it much except for a few. And who are the few that hear it? They're the ones who labor and are heavy laden like everybody else, but who, unlike everybody else, know that they labor and are heavy laden. And it's in that realization that I'm not who I thought I was, that I've been a fool, that I'm ready to receive this offer of grace and the unexpected, right?
Yeah, that book. I mean, it's very easy to read my new book and see what Buechner is saying throughout that whole book that you're describing, which is a fantastic book. I haven't reread it in a few years and need to go back and read it. But you could really see how I've internalized so many of these things that he's writing about, because he does, understanding the gospel just as sort of a religious idea for me was always kind of dead and flat. But once I understood, like, we love stories because they're tied, because they explain reality. And so does the gospel. It explains reality. Why do we like hearing about what happens to people, whether they're fictional or not? Because it helps us navigate reality. And so for me, that's what I love about Buechner, is he shows the sort of connection between the forms of stories and sort of this religious tradition and religious thought. Yeah. With a way that's not heavy-handed or weird or preachy at all.
Yeah. Yeah. Again, relevant to your story, he says that the tragic is the inevitable and the comic is the unforeseeable. And
yes, that's perfect.
And then he kind of finishes that section by saying, from the divine perspective, it's the tragic that is seen as not inevitable, and the comic that is that's bound to happen. But from where we sit, it looks like the tragedy is inevitable. And
it really, as complicated as modern storytelling has gotten, I mean, the tragic and comic masks, the sad mask or the laughing mask. There, you really still have two choices in life: to be bitter, or sort of to laugh at acknowledgement of your own frailty and weakness, and stop fighting the pain, that the pain's going to come. I mean, I just see it in people who are religious and not religious. I can see one of these two paths. I'm like, wow, this person is so bitter. I see as many bitter Christians as I see bitter non-Christians. So many bitter people in the world, who obviously have a tragic view of the world, that it's all that they're going to be fighting. They're going to fight. They're going to engage in the noble fight for good to win, and they're going to use their own power to do it, their minds and their hearts and their hands, and it's never going to be enough. And it's a sad thing to see. But I see that on the left and the right and the center all the time.
Yeah, yeah. I want to, since this is a book about marriage, I'd like to hear you talk about connections between the writing life and the married life. Not just the married life as subject matter for writing, but I mean, given the fact that this is sort of that writing is almost inevitably a solitary, an inward journey. How do you bring another person along on that journey, or maybe you don't?
Well, with the pandemic and everybody kind of all of a sudden working together, working from home, and most white collar jobs happened in home, so people could see what it looked like. That normalized a lot of things for writers, because that's sort of what writers struggle with all the time. The idea, when you are home and you're working, but intellectual work, brain work, whether it's producing a podcast or creating a magazine, or I don't know, online sales, whatever it is, it involves a lot of staring at a computer, and then you kind of wander around, you stare out the window for a while. You make a snack, you take a shower, take a walk, you think about it, you do some more work. And so spouses would see that, partners would see that, and it would look really weird. Like, people realized how strange work looked, white collar work especially, when you saw it happening in real time. But that's what writers have struggled with all the time, is that you're sitting at a computer, you're staring out the window, you're wandering around the house, and your partner's looking at you like, what are you doing? Like, no wonder you haven't written anything. You look aimless, And so, some of the practical tools for a working writer is try to write where nobody can see you. Let there be a little magic and mystery to it. Otherwise, they'll realize that you're just staring out the window most of the time. One thing that my wife and I have done is I can work from home a lot of the time in the stuff that I do for the university. But I really like going away and then coming back, whether it's writing a book or teaching a class that's online, even teaching an online class. Like, go away, go to your office at the university to do it. You'll like everybody more when you come home. And they will like seeing you more. So I think it's really important for writers, especially those who are married and live in spaces with other people, is don't let it all just kind of don't let your writing kind of bleed out into everything else you do. Set some parameters, like during the school year when we have 3 daughters. And when school starts, I stop writing at about 7 a.m. And from 7 to 7:30, I sort of help get everybody out the door. Now, they're 12, 15, and 17 now, so they don't need help getting dressed. But, making sure school lunches are packed and papers are signed, and making sure that the dog is fed, and if they're all standing around and they don't have to go to school for another 10 minutes, getting them to empty the dishwasher with me. So I that's a rule. I stop at 7 o'clock, and for 30 minutes, I'm on lifeguard duty with my wife, with the kids. And then as soon as they're out the door, I'm back at my desk. So it's good to set up some parameters like that.
Yeah.
My wife might complain. She doesn't as much anymore because she understands it now, but before all of this happened, she would complain about me being shiftless when I'm sitting here trying to write. But she didn't complain about the book checks, the royalty checks. So every time I would get one, I'd be like, see this? This is what I made when I was.
This is what all the staring out the window was for.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Or if I got
the mid-afternoon naps.
Yeah. When I get a check for a magazine story, I'm like, remember when I was like moaning face down on the bed? I was like, this is what I wrote. So, and she gets it now and she laughs about it, but it is a weird experience.
Yeah. Her chapter in this book, by the way, is so good.
It's the best chapter in the book. It's so good.
I wasn't going to say that, but since you said it, I think that may be right. It's, how much does Lauren write?
She doesn't write at all. That's what's so frustrating, man. It's so good. She just this is one of those things that, a writer will one out of every 10 stories. It's so urgent and so present in the front of your head that you just got to get out. Yeah. And I've had a few stories like that, and those are nice when they happen, but they don't happen a lot. And it felt like this story had been waiting to sort of burst out of her for a long, long time. But I did joke around with her. It took me 10 years just to figure out how to write okay. Mm-hmm. And so to see her knock out such a beautiful chapter, it took very little editing. I did a pass over it, and I was like, maybe more here, maybe a little less here. But that was it. And I was really impressed. She has no interest in writing anymore.
So they didn't give her the bug. She's done.
No, she does not have the bug. I was like, we could write a funny book on parenting and we would sell 1 million books. And she's like, I don't know. I'll let you handle it. She's like, I'd like to stay married, so I don't think we should write a book together.
Yeah. The day after your wife sort of dropped this bomb on you that, she was in love with somebody else and wanted you to go away. You got up the next morning and wrote.
Yeah.
And you say in your book that, writing is how you make sense of your life. I can't imagine getting up and writing the next day after something like that. But I don't know. That's not a question, but it's an opening for you to begin making remarks if you're so.
Well, it wasn't really okay. Well, I'm going to go work on my next book. It wasn't like that. It was more of the habit and routine of okay. Well, this is now at that so every day I'm up around 5:30 and I write for 2 or 3 hours. And at the time that all this happened, this scene that you're describing, that happened in 2017. And I was writing at home then. I wasn't writing out at a coffee shop. In those days, we had a big enough house where I could have an office and stuff. So I knew, but really my leaving and going to the coffee shop to write the day after I found out was because I didn't know what to do with myself at home. Mm-hmm. I really didn't want to be in the same space as my wife, as you would imagine, because I didn't know what am I going to say something in front of my kids? It just didn't feel safe to be at home. And so to take my laptop and go to the coffee shop, that felt much safer and more really a safe place. And also I don't think I could look at my kids that morning. I think it would have torn me up inside to see them, to know kind of how their reality was about to shift like mine was shifting. Mm-hmm. So it just felt like a safe place to get out. And while I was there, I did some, it also helped me think about what to do with this marriage situation. But I couldn't resist. I opened up a blank document and I was like, this feels like a story that it felt like a novel that suddenly I had woken up inside of. Yeah. like, Kafka, he woke up as a roach. I woke up as a man who had been cheated on in the middle of this happy family, like really happy, normal, healthy family. Clearly was not as happy and healthy as I thought. And so immediately I was like, this is a story. So I started writing these notes out. Even though I didn't know what it was. I mean, I didn't know if anything would come of this. This was literally just me, like, it was almost like talking to a friend about what was happening right then. That's really what it was.
It was fiction that you were writing, correct? I mean, you were writing a story in which you have to understand the motives of the characters. Is that what you were? Do I understand that correctly? There was I mean, it was not a diary entry. It was something else.
Right. I think the idea of writing this as nonfiction seemed so remote. Like that didn't even seem like a possibility because I had just had, my wife had just red pilled me, without me asking. And so the idea, like that would have been too, if you had walked into the coffee shop and you're like, hey, you're going to write a memoir about what you just found out, I would have asked you what a memoir was. I didn't even know, even though I'd written 2 by that point. It was more the idea of fiction is felt, at least to a memoirist, felt removed and kind of safe and out here in a world that you could control. I originally, and I still wonder, like, what if I had written this as a novel? You know why I didn't? The real reason I did not write this as a novel is because it was so close to home. Even if I had changed circumstances of the book and changed the names and had people live in a different city, I knew that if I had done that, people would wonder, did this really happen? And we would both be put back in a position of covering up the truth. And I thought, I'm so sick of hiding and keeping things hidden from people. Like I did keep my wife's affair and our marital implosion secret from lots and lots of people the first time it happened, including the children. And that was really exhausting. I'm not very comfortable. I'm honest to a fault. I can't really care. I have no places to carry extra baggage on. I just don't have any hooks or cubby holes like some people do. And so I realized, I've got to tell this story. I cannot cover it up, change names, put it in a different city. I just need to tell this story because I'm really tired of keeping things secret.
I know you need to run in just a minute, so I wanted to ask you maybe one last question, and that is, you talk about you mentioned briefly in your book that you think most divorces involve a failure of imagination. Can you tell me more about that? I'm sure there are people listening to this conversation who have their own marital struggles and maybe don't see a way forward.
Well, let me first say, I do talk in the book in the last chapter about, that, sometimes divorces have to happen. We know this. This book is not, it's not really an anti-divorce book. There are situations with addiction and abuse, obviously, infidelity, violence. There's a lot of reasons, good reasons for marriages to end, and I don't think any wise religious or non-religious person would disagree with that.
Sure.
However, the real question of this book is, just because I have a warrant for this marriage to end, does that mean it should? And like my wife honestly, she thought I was going to be so happy to find out she was having an affair and in love with someone else. She thought I would be like, yes, I am free. She thought I was miserable as she was, and that I would happily hand her the keys to half of our belongings and the keys to half of the custody and say, this is great. Like, she really thought that. And so the book is it's a hypothesis. It's an experiment of, I didn't know how this book would end when I started it. I'll answer your question, but I really didn't know how this book would end because I was in the midst of living it as I started sort of taking notes and writing some stories and trying to articulate the story for this sort of imaginary reader who was out there. Sort of like a therapist, sort of like a stranger, sort of like a friend. They're all just kind of hovering out there in the space in front of my eyes. And so I'm trying to tell them the story and articulate what happened. And I'm one of those people out there. The Harrison in my head is sort of out there in the audience listening. So I really didn't know how this would end. But one thing I discovered as I was writing this, and that I discovered as I would speak to my wife about her experience, is so much you can think yourself into a corner when you're married. You can convince yourself that your spouse would be happier married to somebody else. You can convince yourself that you'll never be happy again with them, that they'll never look at you, or that you'll never look at them the way you used to look at each other, that sex will never be as good as it once was, that every day henceforth is going to be worse than every day that has come if you stay married. And I found that, the old Tim Keller meme that's been going around for the past few months, where he says, he's quoting somebody else who says, my wife has been married to 5 men and they're all me. And I really do believe that you might marry your soulmate, but your souls aren't going to stay mated for very long, because when 2 people are married, when they're in close quarters and they're trying to navigate existence together, you become each other's greatest potential enemy. Mm-hmm. And so no matter how soulmated you are, you know who I hear talk about soulmates the most? Poets who have been married like 3 and 4 times. Those people talk endlessly about soulmates. And I'm like, bro, I don't think you know what that is at all. I think you're just thinking somebody that you're really simpatico with, and you would also like to have sex with them. That seems what most people mean by soulmate. So for me, it's like realizing, like when I say most divorce in my experience is a failure of imagination, it's because you have to be able to think, like I had to remind myself of good times. Mm-hmm. Like when I was things were at our darkest, and I talk about this in the book, I went out and got, this giant box of photographs that we kept under our bed and just pulled them out just to remind myself that there were so many happy times, and they weren't all in the first year of marriage or in the first year of dating, that we had happy times a year ago. We had happy times that Christmas where she was texting this guy and they were kind of in a relationship already. And yet I'm looking at these pictures and I'm like, this was not an unhappy family. My wife was doing something at the time that was very dangerous and clearly putting our family at risk. But I look back at these things, I'm like, there's so many happy memories here. And so just trying to remember, like, okay, well, we had happy memories. Maybe that means we can have more happy memories. You also have to get over the fact, like, humans change so much, and it was so easy to hate my wife when all this went down, and just reminding myself, like, that she went through periods where she hated me. Mm-hmm. And I think she was changing in that when she got really mad when she realized I did not want to kick her out, that I told her she could leave, but I wasn't going to make her leave. She got so mad. She wanted me to be so mad at her to make it easier, whether it meant my becoming violent or burning all her. If I burned all her clothes in the yard, it'd have been real easy for her to leave. Yeah. But I didn't. I cut the grass. And even that was funny. I'm like, here you leave right now. I am cutting the grass. I just found out that you're in love with somebody else. And you know what? I'm just cutting the grass. Like, it's just, I think that that both partners have to realize it can be better than it is. When it's at its worst, it really can be better. But it takes you both. You can't think your way to better because it's 2 of you who have to do it. And that's why therapy, not just therapy, but talking with friends, being open and honest with each other. But therapy is so good at giving you a neutral place to turn to your partner and say things, and because there's a third person there, it's very hard to fight because you don't want to be embarrassing in front of this other person.
Yeah.
It's so helpful at helping you see things that you did not know about your partner that would be really good for you to know.
Yeah.
My wife will give me so many more compliments in therapy. It's awesome. Like, she never compliments anybody. She's just not that kind of person. I mean, she does sometimes. She can be very sweet to our children, but she's not effusive with compliments to people. But like, sitting there in therapy, she would say something like about like this one particular moment when she, really wanted to have sex, and she said that, and I was like, say more. Like, gosh, this is such great. It felt so good to realize that there was a point at which my wife really wanted to have sex with me recently. And I'm like, you gotta like find a way to tell me, like, maybe there can be a signal, you tell me you're here. That's what's so good about therapy is I have seen so many different sides of my wife in therapy that I would not get to see when we're just sort of falling into our ruts of being two old married in the house. That's the part of the imagination, is cultivating and remembering new possibilities. There's so much in the Bible about if God can get the sparrows all their food, what can he do with you? If he dresses up the lilies like this, what can he do with you? He can make this valley of bones dance again. And that's what's so beautiful about the gospel, and what's so beautiful about people who choose to smile in the face of tragedy, is the hope that's there. So it's easy to lose hope in a marriage, man. It is so easy. But this story, if it gets out, hopefully people can see it and go, damn, like, that's a pretty bad marriage. And they made it out. And I hope it can give people hope. Man, my friends, music, art, my children, my dog, so many things gave me hope through these dark, dark moments.
Well, Harrison, I think anybody who reads this book is going to feel a lot of hope. I know it gave me hope. So thank you. And thanks for being here. I hope we get to talk again soon.
I appreciate it, Jonathan. And let's do it again. I love this show.
All right. Thanks, man.
This podcast is brought to you by The Rabbit Room, where art nourishes community and community nourishes art. And all our podcasts are made possible by the generous support of our members. To learn more about us, visit rabbitroom.com. And to become a member, rabbitroom.com/donate.
If you've enjoyed this podcast episode, consider joining the Rabbit Room membership. Your membership helps sustain this community, funding everything from publishing and podcasts and theater productions to events and programs that support artists who create with a Christ-centered vision. We'd love to have you on board. Learn more at rabbitroom.com/member.